It is my absolute pleasure to be joined by Mark Berlin today. We're going to hear all about Mark and his background shortly. And I want you to know that this is a really important conversation. And I want to begin by recognizing, Mark, with you, that your recent decision to resign from the Board of Trustees of the Canadian Human Rights Museum clearly was not taken lightly, and we will get into that. The Canadian Museum of Human Rights is not just any museum, it's Canada's National Human Rights Museum. And that carries a public mandate, public trust, a responsibility to approach difficult subjects with seriousness and with care. And for some time, Brith Canada has been raising concerns about the museum's planned exhibit, Palestine Uprooted, Nakba, Past and Present. And we've done so because this is not simply a curatorial matter. It goes to questions of public confidence, of institutional responsibility, and the way that contested history is presented by a national institution. And we have asked the museum to engage meaningfully with the Jewish community, to be transparent about the process behind the exhibit, and to ensure that a subject of this magnitude is handled in a way that meets the standard Canadians should expect from the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. And your recent resignation has now brought those concerns even into a sharper focus. So today, while we have time together, I want to give you the opportunity to explain in your own words what led you to that decision, what you believe is at stake, what you think needs to happen next. But before we get into all of that and any of the surrounding controversy, I think it's important for people to understand who you are as a person. You're not someone coming at this as a political commentator or an outside agitator. You've spent a career, Mark, in human rights, law, international development, and work connected deeply to the Middle East. So can you start by telling us a little bit about that background and also why the Canadian Museum for Human Rights mattered to you?
Okay. Oh, thank you. First of all, Simon, thank you for giving me the opportunity to chat with you today. It's a real pleasure. I am grateful for the outpouring of support that I've received from B'nai Brith. I've seen all your social media, and I just want to thank you and your organization for all of that. Thanks, and so thank you for having me on. Yeah, I mean, I graduated with postgraduate degree in international law from Cambridge, and immediately it kindled in me a desire to want to pursue a professional career that was not the normal trajectory for a lawyer, but truly to focus on human rights. And so I was very lucky over the course of my career to have a number of opportunities, particularly in the later part of my career. And so starting in the early 2000s, I both had the good fortune to serve as a special advisor on the Middle East with the then Attorney General and Minister of Justice, Irwin Cotler. And what that meant is we were pursuing an initiative that had Professor Cotler and myself travel to the Middle East on a number of occasions. And what we were doing is we were trying to bring together the chief justices of the Palestinians, the Israelis, the Jordanians, and the Egyptians. And so we went to all the capitals, and we had major discussions that we were hoping to convene this gathering. And we were very, very close. It took 2 years of back and forth diplomacy and building bridges. And ultimately, what happened was there were elections in Canada and Egypt and Jordan, and the Middle East, and I was actually an election observer in the West Bank in the 2005 election, I guess. And all of a sudden, everything and all the parties that were party to this planned event, they all lost power, and so that ultimately failed. At the same time, I was the Director General of International Development. It's called International Legal Programs for the Department of Justice. And under that, and given my love for the region and my desire to really want to pursue, and it sounds lofty, but really want to try to pursue or contribute to pursuing peace in the region, I established an office of the Attorney General of Canada in Ramallah. And we had a physical office for started in 2006. And I had a resident director from Canada move there, but we had locally engaged staff. The vice director was Palestinian, the staff was Palestinian. I became very good friends, and am still today, with the former Minister of Justice. And so we were working on building institutions of statehood. We were building the prosecution service for the Palestinians. In that, it was my belief that for there to be a lasting peace, Israel had to have a party of almost equality, not almost, but of equality. And the Palestinians need to establish institutions of statehood to enable them to connect on an equal basis with their counterparts in Israel. And so by building an Attorney General's office and prosecution service, we felt that we were making our contribution. And so it was a region that I worked in, I loved, I cared about, I knew, I devoted myself for several years to it. So I think I come at it, of course, with a good understanding of the region, but in particular, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank.
Yes, that's an incredible history and an undeniable connection with meaningful input and contribution. So let's jump really right to the heart of the matter.
Okay.
You've resigned from the board of the
Right.
National Human Rights Museum.
Right.
Not something that anyone would take lightly, but certainly someone with your deep passion and conviction for the region.
Mhm.
So what brought you to the point where you felt that you could simply no longer be associated in that way with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights?
Yeah. I mean, I'll preface it by saying you asked me earlier, and I didn't respond to clearly. You asked me about, why I want to join the museum. And as you know, it's an appointment by the government. You're appointed from the Prime Minister's office. And, I put in my application. I thought perhaps I have something to contribute. I care about human rights. And I was just so fortunate when I got the call that I would be appointed to the board for a 4-year term and then get reappointed right after that to this day. So in total, 8 years. With it possibly being reappointed for 3 or 4 more years, which was coming up around this time, to me, it was almost the acknowledgement that people thought there was something valuable that I might contribute based on my experiences and my studies. And so I was thrilled to accept the appointment. What happened was, in the last number of years, the museum's basis for existing and its mandate has diminished greatly. A museum really has its moral authority, must depend on fairness. It has to depend on intellectual rigor and a contextual integrity. And so when a museum abandons its scholarly pursuits in promoting human rights through an exhibit or a program, and it lacks the even-handed fairness and balance required, then what happens is the museum then becomes, it's compromised. And public trust gets eroded, its integrity gets eroded. And frankly, when the museum chooses to go forward with a particular narrative, it does so intentionally. And when that narrative lacks, as I suggest, the intellectual rigor and scholarship, and becomes a focal point for one set of views, then frankly, it not only has become politically and ideologically focused on one group, but I think it becomes a tool of propaganda. And the propaganda for me, or the tool ideological view of the museum, was that they were going to, I believe that they will, through this exhibit, try to demonize and delegitimize Israel. And as a result of all of that, I could no longer stand the board and be complicit in their pursuit of this exhibit or similar programs.
Right. So let's dive a little further into that, because you've spoken publicly since your resignation about how you were denied the ability to fulfill your functions, really, as a trustee and board member.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah.
What is the role? What weren't
Sure.
you able to do?
So the board has a legislative mandate. I don't have to worry about what my authority is. It's stated in legislation. It's the Museum Act of Canada. And for those that really want to dive in, it's section 18.3. I know it well. And what it does is it suggests that the Board of Trustees of this particular museum, as well as the other 5 national museums, we are legally mandated and bound, basically, they call it to fulfill the museum's purposes. And it calls upon us to, quote, manage its businesses, activities, and the overall affairs. I took that seriously. Some of my board colleagues determined that that meant we allow management to manage. My view was, my responsibility was to oversee that. If it said, I am managing as a board member, managing the business activities and the overall affairs, then to me, a controversial exhibit that comes to my attention that has a potential to harm the reputation of the museum squarely falls within that mandate. And therefore, not being able to be provided with the content, not being able to have a meaningful voice, not being able to bring Jewish voices to the table. And I will acknowledge that the museum will say, well, we've spoken to Jewish groups. We've spoken to independent Jewish voices. We've talked to Jews for Palestine. We've talked to scholars who support those groups. And I would go back and say, and that doesn't represent 94% of the mainstream Jewish community. And so being unable to express the views of the community through organizations like B'nai Brith meant I am unable to fulfill my mandate or my job as a trustee. And so I was excluded. And I would say the board was excluded from the process. The museum might respond and say, well, we gave them blueprints and we tell them the size and the scope of what it would look like. And so, yes, I do know that it's about 12 meters long. And I know that there'll be stories and videos. I know nothing of the substance. I know nothing of the content. I know the title, and the title scares me. And the title doesn't give me any comfort that this was balanced and fair and neutral.
So what should the board have done, or what should they still be doing, given this reality that I think is going to be frankly shocking to a lot of people, that the board themselves weren't privy to the content of the exhibit? So,
I mean, again, the museum will say, oh, well, it's a governance board. And that was the response. I've seen that in the newspapers lately in response to my resignation. It said, well, sorry to see him go, but it's a governance board. It's not the responsibility. Well, I guess we have different definitions of governance. I take my definition of governance not only from my sense of duty and responsibility as a human rights lawyer, but it's in the legislation. I'm there to manage the affairs. And therefore, I think the museum has just failed. And it's just come to the state where it's so unfortunate that this will go forward. And so your question suggests, what can we do at this point? Today is Thursday. The exhibit will have its initial release to a VIP audience, I think tomorrow, and then open to the audience in 48 hours or something like that. My time frame might be a little bit off. The exhibit's going forward. I mean, it's not going to be stopped. I've seen no indication from any quarters. The majority of the board supports it going forward. I'm in the minority, or I was in the minority. The majority of the board is like, nothing to see here. It's all good. We got to tell difficult stories, and we're okay telling difficult stories. I guess they're also okay telling one-sided narratives, but they chose as a board to go ahead with it. It won't stop. I would love for the museum, whether they do it on their own or it is strongly suggested by government, that they need to deeply reflect on the harm that can be caused by this exhibit. And what I've suggested elsewhere is that the museum has squandered this great opportunity to build bridges and bring communities together. What in essence they've done is, there's actually nothing wrong with the Nakba exhibit, no matter what. this, in terms of the story needs to be told. There's a reality. The Nakba happened. 750,000 Palestinians did get evacuated from their homes in Israel. But tell the narrative. What's the causation? There was a partition 47. Jews accepted it. The Arab leadership did not. What happened as well? There was a war in 48 where 5 Arab countries launched a war of extermination against Israel. They lost. As a consequence of that, thank God, victory by Israel, 750,000. And there's different reasons and rationale. Some were told to leave by the Arabs. Some were forced out by the Israeli troops. Absolutely. Tell that story, but tell it honestly. Give the consequences of how it was a war, and explain the fact that simultaneously 850,000 Jews were expelled from the surrounding Arab states. If you tell that whole story, that's the role of the museum. You provide the truth. You don't provide a half a truth. So it's not so much what the exhibit is, it's what the exhibit will not be. And it will not be the whole story, and it will not be the whole truth. To answer your question, what should they do? If it opens on Saturday, on Sunday, acknowledge the error of process, acknowledge the lack of transparency, acknowledge the fact that you have failed the Jewish community, and immediately try to heal that rupture between the museum and the Jewish community, and bring them into the building. You and other organizations have pled for 2.5 years to have a seat at the table. You were denied. Have that seat on Sunday. Start the dialogue. Have a meaningful process of consultation. And you know what? Let's reimagine that exhibit in its totality. And once you've, in my mind, once you've gained the trust, which is lost by me personally, I have no trust or faith in the museum leadership, none whatsoever. They could regain it by showing this hand to the Jewish community, bring them in. Once you've regained the trust of the Jewish community, bring in the Arab Muslim leadership, the Palestinian leadership in Canada. Let them sit together. Let them understand each other's trauma. Let them understand each other's sufferings. Let them understand each other's views, and reimagine the exhibit as it should be, that the Canadian Museum of Human Rights is providing a space for Jews and Muslims to come together in a shared historical event and bring it to a Canadian audience going forward.
Right, and while it sounds so unique and novel as an approach, that also fits squarely within the mandate of this museum under the Museums Act. So, at a time where the world, and certainly in Canada, has been filled with misinformation and disinformation, one-sided narratives, false narratives, where anti-Zionism has been conflated with anti-Semitism. The wound is being felt so much more with the timing as well. So, Mark, one of the reasons I think your decision to resign has resonated is that it doesn't seem to be driven by politics or self-interest. It really appears to have been a serious and principled decision by someone who actually spent 8 years trying to serve the institution and its mandate and its purpose from within. Now, when I've looked at some of what's popped up on social media and commentary, etc., some people have asked the question, well, if this was such a battle, why ride it out for 8 years? Why didn't you resign sooner? But then you get the other side also, where you have people saying, oh no, an internal voice of reason is no longer at the table. So you're kind of getting, some of these comments from both sides. So how would you respond to those challenges, and how did you weigh the decision, which I'm sure you contemplated both sides of that equation? So talk about that a little bit.
Up until almost 2 weeks ago, it's been gut-wrenching. This wasn't easy. I didn't take it lightly. I had hoped and expressed an interest actually in being reappointed, and I thought that could very well happen. But I thought it could happen, and I thought it would send a great signal that the government was saying, here's a reasonable voice, and we want to keep a seat at the table.
Okay.
I will tell you that my family, my husband, my sister, my brother-in-law, close friends, who I've been sharing my anguish over the last couple of years, the battles I've been going through, said, for the last 2.5 years, that please resign. Like you don't need this. It's like, why are you doing this? It's harming your mental health. It's harming, your anxiety of going to. I must tell you, going to Winnipeg, stop being a joy. It would be one of those like in the stomach, gut wrenching things. Like, oh my God, I have a pain in my stomach. I have to go and listen to this. I have to be, and recently been berated by board members for my views, and or certainly dressed down for my views. And I kept thinking for as long as time I held out the false hope that my voice could nevertheless perhaps influence some of the minds around the board table and perhaps management. And when I finally realized, and when I was confronted with the fact that not only were they not listening to me, but I realized about 4 months ago who they were listening to, I found extraordinarily offensive. They have something called the Palestinian Advisory Committee. And it's been documented in a book by Brian Schwartz, 178-page book documented that the 10 or so members of this advisory committee have expressed deeply hostile views about Jews and Israel, some vitriolic hatred, in fact. And when that came to my attention, I brought to the attention of the board and the management, it was like, oh, no. Even though their website says that the Palestinian Advisory Committee has shaped the exhibit, their words, not mine, they now claim, oh, no. They had a peripheral role. They were just there. We sort of chatted to them now and then. No, I would object to that characterization and would say they fully embraced this group. They didn't listen to any Jewish voices, and that's because that was their decision, that it was going to be this one narrow-sided view. But about 4 months ago, when I found out that this was the group that they were getting their advice from, and it was filled with people who had made such hateful and heinous statements against Jews in Israel, I spent the next 3-4 months trying to remedy that as well. And when I found out that the museum was not going to do anything about it, they weren't going to close down the advisory committee, they weren't going to expel some of the members that had said some of those egregious things. At that point, I thought the exhibit's coming up, and now is the time, despite the fact that there will not be a Jewish voice at the table, and I worry about who I will be replaced with. Somebody gave me some wise advice and said, but Mark, that's no longer your responsibility. That can't be on your shoulders. And so I finally came to the voice. I came to the point where on Monday, after getting the counsel of 2 very eminent, wise Canadians and my family and my husband, I said, you know what? Now I have to make a statement. And I did not ever conceive that this statement would become a national story of the dimensions it has. But in some respect, I'm so grateful it has, because it's, I think, opened up the doors to show the lack of transparency, and I think a dangerous narrative that's going to be put forward by this exhibit.
Right. So the exhibit itself tells, from what we're hearing, and I can only say that because nothing's been shared, disclosed.
Yep.
We don't know really the content, except a general understanding that's out there that the defense to the exhibit, in a way, is that it's meant to tell one community's story, right? The lived experiences. It's not about the history of the region. It's not about the context. They actually, rather than hear that argument, there's an element of cognitive dissonance. Like, this is a position, and this is why it even makes more sense. And on the surface, some people might actually find that reasonable. So why, in your opinion, is it just not sufficient when the institution that's involved is actually Canada's National Human Rights Museum?
2 points. The first one is, you talk about telling a story. I suggested even earlier, the story should be told. Absolutely, I support that. from day one. I said at the board table. I said it when I appeared before the Senate Committee on Human Rights that was studying anti-Semitism last fall. I said, I fully support the story of Palestinian Nakba, of the Palestinian Nakba, to be put forward at our museum. But I'll go on and say, a story devoid of context, a half a story, because I will suggest to you, you cannot sever the displacement of Jews and the displacement of Palestinians from each other. It's not good enough to say, oh, we're going to talk about the Jews later, which the museum seems to now, because of pressure, saying.
Saw that.
I don't see those stories as being severable. So if you tell only half a story, you only tell half a truth. And we're supposed to be not just storytellers, but truth sayers. And a story that has not the fullness of the story becomes just that, a story. It's not historical fact. And I worry that the stories will be seen as historical fact by the viewer. They'll come by and they'll see this story, and I'm sure it'll be heart-wrenching. I'm sure they are. I'm sure they've done them sensitively and properly as a story. But it will stand to be that in people's minds, they will think that's historical fact, and it's not. And to your point about history, I will suggest to you, but for history, there would have been no Nakba. But for 1947 and 1948, there wouldn't have been a Nakba. If they, and I think they may, but I don't know, but when I read on the website, they might even go and start talking about displacement in Gaza. If they do, and they do not suggest that on October 6th, there was peace, on October 6th, there was a ceasefire, on October 7th, a terrorist group called Hamas launched the largest, most vicious extermination of 1,200 beautiful Jewish souls. And one day, the largest massacre since World War II, the kidnapping of 250 Jewish souls and others, there were Thai and Bedouins as well, captured into Gaza. But for those events, there would not have been a displacement in Gaza. So let's be real here. Let's have some intellectual honesty here. The stories are real. Yes, it was tragic what has happened in Gaza. It didn't happen in a vacuum, Simon. It didn't happen out of thin air, and it didn't happen from an animus by the Jews against Palestinians. A war was launched against Israel's existence again. That was a stated aim in October 7th. And in the ensuing 2 or so years of the war, devastation and displacement took place. Let's be honest. Tell the story. And so to say that this is not about Israel or history is so disingenuous and so alarming. That's what I fear is underpinning this exhibit.
You know, Mark, I was in another interview the other day, and I made a comment, and I'm going to share it here again today because context is such an important piece of the conversation that we're having here right now. And I paraphrased Einstein when Einstein said, everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, the fish will live its whole life believing it's stupid.
Yeah.
Right? Context matters. And it's such an important, and the history and the historical context, the seriousness of the issue matters. And parsing it out like that, as you said, is very, very dangerous. And B'nai Brith has raised concerns for a number of years around this, and in particular about consultation and transparency and process.
Yeah.
And from your vantage point, what should meaningful consultation have looked like? And where do you think the museum fell short?
The museum, 2.5 years ago or so, I offered to the CEO, and I remember saying to her, I may not necessarily love every component of this exhibit that you're promoting, But I said, I would love 2.5 years from now, which is curious because we're here now. I said, I would love to be at the front page of the Globe and Mail saying, this is an exhibit I'm proud of. And I said, I would love to be a bridge and help you have discussions with the Jewish community. I never got a response to that. I was never taken up on that. I never received one phone call. I never received one text that said, Mark, this is a great opportunity. We'd like to take you up on it. So what should a consultation have looked like? They didn't have to use me. I'm a board member. They could have had their own experts. I wasn't going to facilitate. I was going to make introductions. And because I always said, I'm not a spokesperson for the Jewish community as I sit around the board table. I happen to be Jewish. And so I wear that hat. I happen to wear a lot of other hats. And so I was bringing that to the table as the only Jew at the table. What it should have looked like was with as much attention paid to listen to the legitimate Palestinian voices, to give them the source of information for this exhibit, they should have spent that exact same amount of time listening to Jewish voices. And I know we're not a monolith. I know we're not all one voice. And they have their perspective from their independent Jewish voice community. But the 94% plus the mass Canadian Jewish community was shut out. Why were they not brought to the table? And meaningful consultations doesn't mean I had a conversation, I'll let you know the exhibit was going to happen, which they claim they did in February. They sent out a letter to all the Jewish community that perhaps you got it and said, oh, just to let you know, we're going to do this exhibit. That's not consultation. That's actually an embarrassing, disrespectful way to approach the Jewish community. Bring them in, talk to them. We have scholars across this country, not just people like Professor Brian Schwartz, but I'm part of the of NECA, the network of educators of Canada against anti-Semitism. There's over 450 members, Jewish and not Jewish, but people scholarly, based with great intellect and scholarship in history and Middle Eastern studies and human rights. And I offered that to them. We offered them the Raoul Wallenberg Center. And they said, oh, I'm sorry, these ones are activists, and this one's not good enough, and these are lobby groups. Well, what was the Palestinian Advisory Committee? They may have been individuals, but individuals that came with hate. And so I was offering them all these, I kept saying, what about these people? And they absolutely refused and shut down and had excuses each time to shut out the Jewish community. The Jewish community was shut out. We were told, it's not your story. We're only going to tell the story of the Palestinians. And as I suggest to you, they just recently said, oh, because of pressure, I believe, from government, and said, I'm almost certain it what came from government, and said, oh, you know, there's a big problem with the Jewish community. Maybe you should think about highlighting their displacement. And all we've been told is that, yes, they're getting on it, and there will be something at some point in the future. It could be digital, it could be a pamphlet, it could be exhibit. Come on.
Yeah. I hear you. And I guess now the way this is evolving, it's become bigger than actually the one exhibit in and of itself. And it hasn't even opened yet because now it raises questions about governance, about public trust,
Yes.
about the obligations of a federally supported national institution.
Yeah.
So, what does your resignation say about the state of governance at the museum itself, beyond what you've already shared? And what responsibility, since you're speaking about government, what responsibility does the federal government have now with the opening imminent?
So I would say, again, two things. One, I think my resignation signals that it's a ringing indictment of the way in which the board is seen by management, by which this board fails to understand its obligations. And I would say that in board meetings, I would say to colleagues, I would challenge them and say, why are you not willing to undertake your responsibilities? Are you so thrilled that you want to not create controversy, and so you're just going to go along and just allow this to happen? I heard a lot of people say to me at board meetings, well, and here, one thing was quite offensive. People would always say, well, human rights stories are challenging and difficult anyways, but we have to tell them. My response would be, but you have to tell them honestly and with integrity. And then what I would say, and I started because I would raise this so often, people would say to me, well, Mark, there are so many other tragedies going on in the world. What about in Somalia? And what about in Sudan? And what about this and that? And why are you always focusing on this? And that was the tenor of their comments to me. Frankly, that's offensive. So I think not all. I think there are some very good, I think they're all probably good, decent human beings, some of whom I think have failed in their understanding of what their responsibilities are. I think it's a failed board. It's a divided board because I resigned, but I wasn't the only person espousing these views. We were a minority. I would say the majority supported it, a minority did not. To your question, what should the government do? You know, I was part of my background, I didn't explain it, I can say it again, but I can tell you now, is over my career at the Department of Justice, I happened to serve as both legal advisor and policy advisor to 4 different ministers of justice, to 4 different attorney generals, 2 conservatives and 2 liberals. And as an advisor to a minister, my job is to ensure that the minister is able to run the department, pursue the political agenda of the government, marry policy of the department with the agenda of government. And I would give advice to ensure that my minister did not get mired in controversy. And so now we have a minister mired in controversy. I'm not one of his advisors. He has advisors that can tell him what to do. He hasn't called me to ask me my view, and that's fine. No, nor am I expecting that. I have thoughts that I would tell him. I would say things. I would hope that his advisors would tell him things about ministerial responsibility, ministerial oversight. The Museums Act of Canada is a piece of legislation that falls under his department. He is the minister responsible for the museum, the 6 national museums, of which the Museum for Human Rights is but one. Under his auspices, he appoints the board. The board serves at pleasure. If he's no longer pleased by the board, he has an alternative. The CEO serves at pleasure. If the minister does not believe that she's fulfilling her responsibility to Canadians, he has an option there as well. So that's in relationship to the management and the board. And as I suggest, the minister's advisors are free to give him all kinds of advice what to do. And it's beyond small Mark Berlin to suggest what he should do. I have thoughts, what I would have liked him to do. He didn't ask me for them.
So we at B'nai Brith have actually called for the opening to be deferred. And we've also asked for the museum to disclose explicitly who was consulted. We've also given our expectation that records should be preserved, and also that there should be a transparent review of the exhibit that should be undertaken by a neutral expert.
Yeah, right.
So these are some of the things that we would expect. You mentioned earlier about the failure and the breach of trust that's resulted from the choices of the museum up until now. Is there anything beyond what you've already talked about that you think could happen that would in a meaningful way restore public trust to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights? You talked, just a refresher, you talked earlier in our conversation around the day after it opens, providing more contextual information in the museum, that could help. Do you think there are any other steps beyond what's already been discussed?
Listen, it's clear there needs to be a rapprochement with the Jewish community. It's broken. The rupture is there. I don't know how real their desire is to heal that division, heal that wound. I don't know what action. It's hard for me to understand beyond the consultation, embracing sincerely, listening to the Jewish community. I'm not quite sure what. You mentioned that a review of the exhibit. I heard, I've been told, and I was still the board member, that they were bringing in, due to the pressure that they felt from the Jewish community and I think from government, they said they were bringing in third-party examiners. So they brought in two people, one person who has a long history and would define herself as a staunch anti-Zionist, and she was brought in to review the exhibit. She will tell you, and I think she's disappointed, that's not what happened. She was brought in to review the bibliography of a study guide that may or may not be attached to this exhibit. Two things that are very, very troublesome here. That was the type of person that would be brought in to review this material. They disingenuously said that she was doing a review of the exhibit. She's not. It was just of a bibliography, of a study guide. I think that study guide has the potential to be even more harmful than the exhibit. That study guide and that research guide should not see the light of day until there's a thorough examination as to its contents. When I look back to a program that the museum put on a couple of years ago, and the intention was great. It said, how do you talk to your kids about the Gaza war? And all the sources that they cited were sources like Amnesty International, UN this, UN that, UN this. We know even from yesterday, the discredited when it's like the UN expert on sexual violence, and she couldn't look at that magnificent woman who had been a rape victim. And I don't know if you saw today that there was another UN expert who replaced, I don't know if you saw this, the Jewish flag, on the Jewish flag, they replaced the Magen David with a swastika. And when brought to her attention, this rapporteur expert said, I look forward to a conversation. And so it's, in my mind, the UN is so sullied in terms of being anything but in its reputation of being anything as neutral, and is so staunchly anti-Semitic. Those were the sources used in that study guide. I fear greatly that if those are the types of sources cited in this study guide, that long before that becomes ever available to the public, especially student groups or universities or kids in primary schools, that study guide should not see the light of day. That's something that I worry about. That would be something quite concrete that I think action can be taken on immediately.
Yeah, this is something we should all be worried about, just as Canadians. And B'nai B'rith has been actively pushing for accountability on this issue for a number of years.
Yeah.
Both publicly and directly with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, including through formal submissions, calls for meaningful consultation. And
how was that reception?
Well, we're still waiting.
Exactly.
And with that, demands for transparency, which you've also addressed. Now, we do a lot of advocacy work, fighting for human rights and inclusivity within this country, fighting for the rights of marginalized communities of all kinds. So given the roadblocks that we've encountered with this National Museum, what role does sustained advocacy play here? When you have this federally supported national institution that is unwilling to even address the serious concerns being expressed to them.
Yeah, it's disconcerting to hear you say these things in the extreme. It's disrespectful, it's disconcerting, it's wounding, frankly, to hear this. What it is you almost see this institutionalized marginalization of Jewish voices, the erasure of Jewish voices. That can't happen. B'nai B'rith has to stay strong in its advocacy, and even when you come up against roadblocks, you have to keep going. You can't stop. Hopefully the Jewish community looks to you for leadership, and other Jewish organizations all have a role to play. You cannot stop. And so you do what you do best. You lobby government, you lobby ministers, you lobby opposition. You try to get into the hearts and minds. You find opportunities to speak It's not easy to speak at universities, to speak at colleges. We know that, you go to Hill houses and try to, but you can't just preach to the converted. And so by saying you can't just preach to the converted, it's easy. Like, I would think it's easy to go to the Conservative Party and make your case. They've already sort of, for the most part, put themselves out there and said, we are behind the Jewish community. We want to go forward. If the Prime Minister put together this Human Rights Council and said, we want to get an inroad there. And so when I say you can't just speak to the converted, or you can't just speak to the minion, then you know what? Keep going with the government. Make your voices heard at that Human Rights Council. Keep going to Mark Miller. Keep going to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister gave a speech at the Holy Blossom Synagogue. Follow up on that. And now, Prime Minister, thank you for your words. And now what? So we don't let them off the hook, and we fight and we fight and we fight. I'm off the board. This fight doesn't end for me. I will tell you, and I can admit that I'm a born-again Jew. I'm a born-again Jew on October 7th. I was, for 10 years, I've been going to Buddhist classes. And I was always joking, saying I'm a Buju or a Jubu. On October 7th, I became a born-again staunch Zionist. I'm a proud Zionist. And so I will, as long as I can find other platforms to speak, and if I'm invited, and if I could talk, I hope people will see me as somebody who is a bit of an honest broker. I'm not trying to divide. I'm not saying don't do. I'm not saying these aren't legitimate voices that need to be heard. I'm saying let's bring people together. Let's hear all the voices. And so I will continue to speak out wherever I can. And I know that you will as well. So I'm by nature an optimistic person. And I see this as one small defeat, but that doesn't stop me.
All right. So finally, with the time we have left, Mark, tell all of us watching and listening so carefully to your important messages. When Canadians look back at this moment, what do you hope they understand about why you took the stand that you have taken?
Wow.
What's the principle you're defending here, Mark?
I think the principle is universal for anybody that believes in human rights, stands against injustice, stands against marginalization, stands against demonization or delegitimization of a race, a culture, a peoples. I would say that if you don't stand for something and are willing to put yourself on the line, then you stand for nothing. And I don't want to be a bystander. I can't be silent. I will not be apologetic or appeasing to other people simply because they want to have harmony. If there's disruption that has to happen to make things better, I want to be not just part of it. I want to be at the forefront of that. And I would think that would be the lesson. I know that's the heart, probably the mandate of B'nai Brith, and I would hope others as well. And it doesn't have to be just, it's not a religious thing. It's not a Jewish thing. And I want people to take away from that. Because right now, this is happening to the Jews. This could happen to any other community in Canada as well. This is an example of what happened with the Jews today. It could be somebody else tomorrow. So if you care about a Canada that honors the history of all the people that are here, if you believe in a Canada that is to be a place free of discrimination and disunity, this is your fight as well.
So, Mark, I can't thank you enough for your time and for speaking with us with such clarity and conviction. And I think I'm going to steal a minute to address the point that you just made. Your decision to resign from the Board of Trustees of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights was an honorable and principled act, clearly. And it's not easy to step away from an institution that you have served especially one with a mandate as important as this museum. But there are moments when public trust and historical integrity and moral responsibility require exactly that kind of courage. And this conversation is really about more than one exhibit and more than one institution. It's about the standards that Canadians should expect from a national human rights museum, especially when it takes on histories that are painful and contested and deeply connected to communities here at home.
Yeah.
So to your point, Mark, B'nai Brith Canada will continue to fight, to continue to press for transparency, for accountability, and meaningful engagement with the Jewish community. And the Museum for Human Rights has an opportunity and a responsibility to restore public trust.
Right.
And that's going to begin by listening seriously to the concerns that have been raised, including the concerns that led you to resign. And I hope their ears are open. I hope they're listening to what's being said. I hope the government is listening, the minister is listening, and appropriate action, change, and a new direction can move forward for Canadians and with respect to this museum and this exhibit. Mark Berlin, thank you again for joining us. Thank you for taking a stand, and thank you for being a friend of all Canadians. We appreciate you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.